Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Listen to top figures in the fields of Jain studies, religious studies, vegan studies, and social justice discuss pressing issues of everyday relevance. Together, let's move beyond the realm of personal spiritual growth and connect philosophy, religion, and spirituality to the important task of caring for the well-being of society. Learn about your world and how to change it on the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast.
Greetings, Dr. Cogen Bohanec here, and I'm here bringing you the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, held by Arihanta Institute of Jain Studies. And I am an assistant professor at the Arihanta Institute. And I'm here today with another professor at Arihanta, Jonathan Dickstein, who's a good friend and colleague of mine. And we have our different spheres of expertise at Arihanta Institute. I tend to focus a lot on language and literature. And Jonathan does a lot with vegan studies and animal studies and the intersection between that and the Jain tradition. So welcome, Jonathan. I wonder if maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your studies and your approach to Jain scholarship.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, Cogen, for having me. Yes, I'm also assistant professor at Arihanta Institute. And my graduate work, my PhD work, was mostly on animals and animal taxonomies in Vedic literature and say early what we might call Hindu literature. And in recent years, I've kind of pivoted mostly into Jain studies, the Jain tradition and Jain views on animals, on how we treat animals, on the idea of eating animals, prescriptions, proscriptions around animals and animal products, and generally like how we think about animals. How do we, when I don't mean universal we, I mean, how do we humans think about animals embedded in our individual traditions? And I think Jainism has a lot to offer because specifically the ways in which the Jain tradition is sometimes called as biocentric, or we might say very much concerned with the dynamism and vitality of various life forms around us and our kind of obligations towards them. So I think we have a lot to understand about the Jain tradition, and I think the Jain tradition has a lot to offer other traditions, whether religious or secular, when it comes to animals and food.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's very interesting. And a lot of times traditionally, at least last couple decades in the academy, animal studies has been a pretty big field, a growing and emergent field. But I'm also starting to see a movement towards vegan studies. So for example, we're going to have a vegan studies initiative at Arihanta Institute. And I wonder if you might be able to say something about the relationship between animal studies and vegan studies, and then maybe say something about what we're trying to achieve here at Arihanta in terms of vegan studies.
Yes, it's an interesting question. Vegan studies is not necessarily like an established field, some kind of like formal field. A vegan studies course was offered not too long ago at the University of California, Santa Barbara by Professor Renan Leroux. And this was kind of the first time we talked about vegan studies as something like a concentration or a certificate, and maybe even aspiring towards something like a major or a minor or a major or a graduate degree. And so I think you're right. So there is a relationship of animal studies to vegan studies. And what we have with animal studies is this really broad category. I explain this to students sometimes. Animal studies can really mean any kind of studies involving animals, also including experimenting on animals or doing other kinds of trials on animals could be referred to as animal studies. So that's obviously not what the kind of animal studies we're interested in. Then there's also human animal studies, which is about the relationship between humans and animals, historically, philosophically, and just any kind of notion of relation or relationship that has had significant impact in history. However, there's not a critical lens to it. It's not really about the kind of ethics or kind of systems of power or oppression or domination and the worldviews that contribute to these specific kinds of relationships. So it's not a very critical discipline or area, but it's just basically descriptive. And then what has emerged in the past few decades is what's known as critical animal studies. And this is a field that is really looking at kind of a critical eye on human-animal relations. Are they ones of power? Are they ones of exploitation? Are they right? Are they wrong? How do we even start to answer those questions? What is the relationship between humans and animals insofar as they have effects or actually drive oppression within human populations as well? So this is also the idea of not just what are the ethics of how humans relate to animals, but how has the way humans relate to animals perhaps even intensified, entrenched, or in other ways modified the ways that humans exert power and dominance over other humans? And in that way, we actually start to look into things like, obviously, like history, anthropology, archaeology, diaspora studies, food studies, religious studies. And that's really where I come in with religious studies. It's kind of my background is how are we looking at religious views towards animals, and how have religious views, however we define that term, dictated the kinds of relationships humans have with animals, and how does that also affect human-human relations within those traditions? Now, that's all to say I still haven't kind of described what vegan studies is, but this kind of critical animal studies, in my viewpoint, is a key component of it. And so what we'll see as I get into the initiative is how much critical animal studies plays a role in vegan studies. As for vegan studies itself, what I would say is that vegan studies as a whole kind of shares something like a vegan horizon point. And what I mean by vegan, I mean it in a pretty basic sense. I mean that the horizon point in vegan studies is kind of a shared trajectory towards a world in which human beings are no longer using animals for labor, for entertainment, for medical science, for food, for clothing. And this is kind of like a global horizon point. So based on how we understand that pretty much all human relationships with animals are ones of subordination and domination. Even if we quote unquote treat animals well, it's usually within a framework that has already subordinated these animals and diminished their value. And so we share a common trajectory towards a world, and it can be aspirational in that sense. It's not kind of an overnight thing, in which we are no longer commodifying animals, exploiting animals, extracting substances from animals, in the sense that we treat them like tools for our use. And so vegan studies, I say, is basically looking at animal studies, philosophy, religious studies, history, food studies, disability studies, gender studies, race studies, all keeping these in mind while we kind of keep an eye on and move towards that horizon point. So that's vegan studies. I've been kind of talking for a lot. I can pivot into the initiative, but I was wondering if you have any other question before I do that.
Oh yeah, I mean there was so much there that you said. It's really exciting. In recent times, I come from a position of not animal studies proper, but environmental ethics that looks at animal issues. Animal ethics in relationship to environmental ethics. So I do a lot with ecofeminism. And ecofeminism might be sort of defined as the sort of mutually reinforcing paradigms of oppression and domination between the environment and between women, and that sort of interrelated approach. In recent times, and then of course I've been in the animal rights movement for about 30 years, being married to a fairly famous animal rights activist, Hope Bohanec. But a new term has kind of come up in the animal rights movement, intersectional vegan. Now we had a conversation recently with Carol Adams, who wrote The Sexual Politics of Meat, and she actually cautioned us not to use the term intersectionality with regards to any issue, not just animal issues, where race isn't foregrounded, because that's the sort of context where intersectionality was termed. And then you also mentioned some interdisciplinary relationships that are going on there. That, when you talk about the relationship between vegan studies and gender studies, which you mentioned there in the end, that almost implies a mutual reinforcing mechanism. Now, I guess my question in all of that is that in the animal rights movement proper, there's been a lot of pushback against what's sometimes called intersectional veganism. Whether that's a proper term or not, it's another question. But there's been a pushback against that, sort of the argument being that if you focus on just the issue of veganism, then you can, not get distracted by other issues. But then, of course, the idea that oppression anywhere is oppression everywhere. So you can't really think about animal liberation without thinking about human liberation. They're so interrelated. So I'm wondering is in the academic field of animal studies, critical animal studies that you're talking about here, is there sort of an acceptance of more of an intersectional, if we can call it that, approach? Is there a pushback against that? Are there boundaries between disciplinarity? Like, are there some people who resent the idea of dialoguing or doing an interdisciplinary approach between gender and animal studies or race or colonialism? So I wonder if you had any thoughts about that, if that's kind of not too convoluted of a question.
Oh, no, I think it's a great question. And I would say, I don't want to, we could go on for hours actually about so many of the points and smaller points you bring up. But I think 2 points I'd like to make is one is that people like Silko, AFCO, and I was talking about like animal is not like a biological designation. It's almost, you could say something like a racial designation. It's a social constructed category. And, legal scholar Manisha Dekka says it's a violence producing category. So to be called animal has nothing to do with your biology, really, in a social sense. It means you are the type of being who can be violated without consequence, in a way. And so I think when we look at that, we realize like that's also a racial category. It's also a gender category. It's what woman referred to or non-man referred to, what Black kind of referred to in many contexts, or disabled. A kind of the subtext was that you could be treated differentially and disadvantageously. And so I think that the idea is that, and when we talk, for example, in other social justice spheres about subhumanizing, dehumanizing, animalizing, it's very strange because there's a sense that if human beings are pushing back against being treated like animals, then that means that the way that animals are treated is okay because they're animals. So animals sits at one end of the pole of the violable, those who can be violated. And at the other end is supposedly humans who cannot be violated. And as we know, there's a long gender, race, ability history as who's considered human or not in a biological sense, but in this kind of constructed social sense. So that's a long way to say is that it's not just intersectional. They cannot be extracted from one another. These kinds of systems cannot be. They actually are mutually reinforcing, but also codependent. Now, that being said, as I kind of written in articles before, is that but we still have to have these kind of specific fronts that we engage. So like feminism or anti-Blackness or disability. There are obviously specific fronts because in the real world, oppression works on bodies and minds. It's not just some idea. And so I think that veganism aside, I think people who are anti-speciesism, so they are against discrimination based on not being human, which is something like an animalism or pro-animalism, however you want to call it, they have justification in saying, hey, animals can't, be on Twitter. They can't be on Facebook. They can't go to court. So they actually need advocates. And they deserve their own space. And they can't be subordinated just on the basis of not being human. And I think the fear, and this is what lends some advocates, I think, to get too heavy, right? And say, I don't really care about human issues, or I'm less sensitive to human issues because I care about animals. It's that sometimes I think there's what, John Rawls refers to it as kind of lexical priority, the kind of like a categorical priority that something has. And it doesn't matter how many other interests are in the other category, it can never outweigh those in the first category, which is to say something like a human life is worth kind of infinite dog lives. You can't add dog lives together and aggregate them and somehow they become more of a priority. Like when you hit the 500th dog and that automatically kind of triggers a greater priority. And so there's the sense sometimes people say things like, why should we care about animals when we have war among humans happening? Or why should we care about animals when there's still caste-based oppression and so on? But I think animalists are right in saying, well, it seems like you're exerting a lexical priority. You're trying to say that animals matter, but only when all human interests have been covered. That's not philosophically plausible. I'm sure you can agree with that too. It's just philosophically unsound, and it perpetuates an anthropocentrism, kind of even just like an exceptionalism in a sense, and which is at the very heart of the critique that critical animal studies and anti-speciesism is saying like, you can't subordinate animals simply based on not being human. And that includes saying that they don't matter as much, and we should only care about them once we've handled all the human issues. As we well know, will never happen. We will always have human issues and human concerns. So to answer your question, it's kind of like a little on both sides. These are embedded, so there's no way to separate them. On the other hand, I think anti-speciesism deserves its proper place. Animals deserve also their proper place and voice.
Yeah, it's as if I'm getting what you're saying, which is really interesting, it's as if as long as the category of exceptionalism, as you said, I really like that term. I've not heard that before. Anthropo-exceptionalism, as long as that exists, then it's just a matter of time before somebody's going to start putting that barrier on, women and people of color and, other global communities, et cetera. So actually, if we're going to eradicate the paradigms of violence, which are the cause of all interrelated forms of violence, then we have to really have a much broader stroke of getting rid of that exceptionalism sort of paradigm if we want to help human issues. And so therein lies the reason why human advocates should be interested in animal issues too. It seems like it kind of works both ways, right?
So yeah, absolutely. And two things. One, I think we just need to explode the binary. I mean, I'm not the first one to say this. Is the human animal, the human nature binary is the problem. It's not about how do we get more human, or how do we tell everyone, all humans, that you also are animals. We have to understand that these terms are constructs. The human is a construct. Animal is a construct. Nature, capital N, nature, is a construct. They're not ontological categories. And they do work. And so I think that's the way in which we can make kind of this kind of total liberationist headway, meaning liberation for all beings. I think what's also important in the vegan studies context, and then I can pivot there, is that the description I'm giving of vegan studies, which is a kind of trajectory of the absence of animal inputs, animal use, animal exploitation, is flexible to local beliefs and ideas. It's not saying you have to buy in this one, say, Euro-American moral philosophical worldview. That's actually not the perspective. And in Jain studies, we see it, right? They're coming to it from a different angle. So that it's not saying like you need to be vegan the way these people are vegan. It's basically keeping the focus on what veganism does as an abstention from engaging in forms of power over vulnerable others. And how you get there might not look the same. But what we see like kind of transnationally are different groups, different individuals, different communities, different religions kind of getting there on their own terms, and sometimes constructively, meaning taking into consideration developments in philosophy or in science or historical data. And that just speaks of how religions change, traditions change. But what doesn't seem to be changing is the movement towards a greater recognition of the intrinsic value of animals. If anything, we seem to really seeing how that's pretty over-determined cross-culturally, meaning like it's hard to deny it more and more because we can get there from various perspectives.
Yeah, wow, really, that was a great addendum point there about being flexible to local ideas, right? I think that's because one of the criticisms that obviously that you're underscoring here is that veganism is sort of like a Western hegemony. The same way, I mean, it's true. It could be. Feminism could also be colonial too. If you use feminism as a lens by which you uphold, the priority or the superiority of a colonial of a hegemonic, Western force, and then use that as a way of beating up and debilitating, a marginalized, colonized group, then even feminism could be problematic. And I guess a similar thing goes to veganism as well, too. But I think that what you're alluding to is this interesting idea that Jain vegan studies kind of problematizes that particular critique, because it's saying like, no, look, there are actually indigenous approaches that can come to the same ideas of veganism based on their own cultural values and histories apart from Western ideas and still come to similar conclusions about the problematic nature of the exploitation and domination of animals. So I think that was a really, really nice point that you made there. And I think it's a good way to address that particular critique. All of this, how do you see that sort of unfolding with the Vegan Studies Initiative at Arihanta Institute? Maybe curriculum design, pedagogy, what kind of people you think will be attracted. And then I suppose you can maybe say something about our relationship with Claremont as well.
Yeah, it's great. So we have three main prongs. There are a couple additional prongs of this Vegan Studies initiative that is beginning this spring at Arihanta Institute. And from the educational side of things, or the educational prongs, there are three aspects. One is adding a veganism, animals, and ecology concentration to our existing master's program in Engaged Jain Studies. So this is a master's program that we at Arihanta teach in partnership with Claremont School of Theology for this terminal MA degree in Engaged Jain Studies, and we share some of the teaching load for this course, for this program. And there will be a concentration now for students who want to focus on Jain studies, but also kind of its relationship to animals and food and the environment. So this is, you take 4 classes in the veganism, animals, and ecology concentration. And there's courses such as veganism, climate change, and environmental justice. Of course, food politics in South Asia and beyond, engaged Jainism and animal advocacy, and Jain veganism in the history of global veganism. And so these are kind of offerings that speak to specific interests of students. And I think the audience here is maybe Jains, but also non-Jains who have gotten involved in, say, the environmental movement or animal movement, or became vegetarian and veganism, and then started to learn about Jainism later. Because as you know, but Cogen, but so many people don't know, like the Jains are the original kind of like, not just vegetarians, but animal-focused vegetarians and non-violence-focused vegetarians, focused on the kind of pain and suffering that is involved in binding, mutilating, and killing animals for food, right? It's not that complicated for the Jains early on. I mean, this is really what motivates that prescription. And so I think individuals coming to this kind of long overlooked Indic community are saying, wow, this is 2,500 years old, this kind of practice. Maybe we have things to learn. And I think we do have things to learn, and we continually are learning. So that's the one aspect, is the concentration in the MA degree at Claremont. And we can speak about that further, but just to lay it out, the second aspect is adding vegan studies courses, specific vegan studies courses, to our self-paced online learning curriculum. And this will also start in the late spring, early summer, in which some of our own professors, but ideally top figures in vegan studies, what I'm calling vegan studies, are going to come in and teach courses for us on the kind of variety of issues, such as how do we feed a growing global population a plant-based diet? What are some of the myths that the animal agriculture industry uses to promote things like happy meat, humane eggs, to kind of convince the consumer about the maybe even necessity and propriety or naturalness of eating animals? And then we have another course coming about the history of animals in the ancient West. Our teachers are teaching a lot about the ancient India, ancient South Asia, but someone talking about how the kind of characterization of the ancient West as being always anti-animal, kind of like leading up to someone like Descartes and some kind of terrible views on animals, that there actually is also a history of vegetarianism in the West and kind of a pro-animalism, and elevating that as well. So, and then we'll have other courses about sanctuaries, about dairy, and I'm really excited to kind of expand our online learning to vegan studies. I think the Jain community, especially the young Jain community, is eager for it. And also, I don't know if anywhere else exists that has specifically online courses in vegan studies. So that's really exciting. Keep your eye open for that. And lastly, just kind of more on a public facing, but also educational aspect is starting in May, the Voices in Vegan Studies speaker series, which will be running monthly until the end of the year. The kickoff event will be in May. And this is really about bringing in top individuals, popular figures, physicians, scholars, sanctuary operators, lawyers in animal studies or animal issues, coming in to talk about a variety of issues in this kind of field of vegan studies, and very public facing, open to all, Q&A sessions, kind of like a formal talk, but also the ability to engage with these individuals. And the audience there is also twofold. It's how do we make, say, not exclusively Jain topical for the Jain community, and also bring in non-Jains to Arihanta, to the world, like kind of the Arihanta educational universe, to say, hey, actually, look at all the things the Jain tradition has to offer. Look how much you can increase your knowledge by engaging with our platform and our faculty. So that's kind of where we're going with, and we're really excited for this program.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's really, really exciting to see, because back when I was an undergraduate, there was no such thing. I remember I wanted to be a medical doctor, and there was the obstacle that you had to dissect animals, and there was just like no idea that that was problematic, because there wasn't even really animal studies back then, what to speak of critical animal studies, what to speak of vegan studies. So I can imagine that, having this as sort of like really kind of a seminal program will create ripples within the academy that hopefully will benefit and veganize, or at least, remove the anthropocentrism of other university disciplines. So it's really exciting. I think that's kind of the importance of the academy in general, is that what you do in the academy doesn't stay in the academy, doesn't stay in your discipline. It tends to have broader cultural effects. That might be an interesting point to ask as well, too, about like the social relevance. How do you view the social relevance of academic work, as opposed to, not necessarily as opposed to, but, there's multiple different ways you could be an animal advocate. And education is kind of like a newer way. Historically, like when my wife was getting started, there was, you protested, and that was kind of your only option. And then the idea of sort of developing vegan popular education, came about. What do you think the potential benefits socially, the potential influence of this? I mean, we get criticized in the academy for being armchair philosophers. Is that a fair critique? Is this really going to be something that has the potential to, bring about the kind of change that we want to see as academics? What do you think about that?
It's complicated. I think that there's a way in which academia, in its publication of monographs and peer-reviewed articles that are behind paywalls and conferences that are not kind of like open to the public, really don't do as much work as they can. I mean, I think about even the amount of views you actually and reads you can get, whereas now we can publish online, whether even on our blog or through a major news outlet, and get much more visibility, much more impact, kind of harnessing the power of social media for better or worse. I think academia's struggle now is just dealing with a world in which the dissemination of knowledge is fundamentally different than it ever has before. When you and I were undergrads, we had to go to a place where the library was, because the library had the books that you needed to read. And if you wanted to study, say, something like Sanskrit, you go to where the Sanskrit is that you want to study with. Now we just don't really need that. And this is part of the reason why we focus on online education at Arihanta, right, is not just because it fits into people's lives and their own pacing, but also because it seems that, dare I say, they're always being obsolete. And so how do we update with the times? And part of that is making our ideas and scholarship more visible. I mean, I think many scholars, especially in the humanities, want their books to make a splash, to be impactful, to be read, to change minds. And so why not, if that's the trajectory, and my goal is to say, inform people, raise awareness, in the most kind of benign senses, but maybe also change people, challenge people, Why not have a speaker series? Why not have online classes accessible anywhere in the world? Why not have a master's in which, like right now, I have a student off the coast of Washington, in Texas, two in India, and we all converge to learn about animal advocacy. I mean, think about how far that can take us. So I think my goal is to bring these conversations into more kind of wider view and public view. And that's why I said earlier that when I view vegan studies, I might have my own perspective, principled and practical. You might have your own. But as long as we share this kind of general horizon point, I want to bring different thinkers together to have hard conversations, about things, whether that's ethical or ethical, pragmatic, not pragmatic, and kind of workshop them together. Because if our goal is ultimately for the sake of sentient beings and not for our own egos and not for our own fame, then we should welcome brainstorming, collaboration, workshopping. And the more that can happen in the public sphere, the more that can happen with input from everyone through greater access, I think that democratization, right? This is part of our goal at Arihanta, democratization of Jain studies. So I want the same. How do we democratize animal studies? How do we learn to speak in different vernaculars? How do we learn from the Buddha's upaya, right? Skillful means. How do we shift to reach people and teach people? That's what my goal is. And so at Arihanta, I just really welcome how the Vegan Studies Initiative is bringing all these together. Yes, an academic concentration, also online but rigorous classes, and then also a speaker series that people can drop into, when they can. So I love this trajectory.
Yeah, and we also have like a strong social media presence as well. I mean, yeah, I think that what you're underscoring there, it's really a mission of Arihanta Institute to democratize Jain studies. And I think that really addresses the common critique of the armchair philosopher, because it seems like our very orientation of our institution is one that challenges that stereotype and really shows us as being dynamically engaged with, the full spectrum of social economic strata of society, not even just Western society, but globally as well. I too have students in Malaysia and India and all over the place. And that's just a really special thing about our program, is that it seems to sort of make our academic work more socially relevant, or as we can say, socially engaged, since this is actually a master's program in engaged Jain studies, is really having that engagement with society seems to be really, really at the core of what we aspire to do here at Arihanta. So I think that there's great hope that anybody who participates in any of these 3 points that you talked about, our master's program in Engaged Jain Studies with the vegan emphasis, with the online public-facing courses that offers courses in vegan studies and in Jain studies in the relationship, and then the speaker series and our social media presence and all of that. I think any person who gets involved in that has a great hope that this is not going to just stay sequestered in the ivory towers of the academy, but these are actually, we're engaged with society as it is. And I think that's a really wonderful point that you brought up there. Thank you for touching on that. You said something in a previous question that I really wanted to hone in on that I thought was really, really important to underscore. You said that Jains have a lot to offer to the discussion of veganism. And we might even say, to the Western vegan movement, even though the vegan movement is certainly international and it's not exclusive to the West, and there have been historical vegan movements, mostly not in the West, like we think about, Chinese Buddhism or East Asian Buddhism, very, very long histories of veganism there. But you said that vegans have a lot Jainism has a lot to offer. Can you think of anything that the West can learn from Jain veganism, maybe the West broadly, maybe specifically Western vegan advocates? What exactly did you mean when you said that Jains have a lot to offer? Let's pull on that thread a little bit.
I think when I can only speak to my upbringing, I come from the Northeast United States, mostly educated in the States. I've traveled a bit, but as like a white male, lower middle class upbringing, kind of some Reform Judaism involved, some Catholicism involved, it's kind of grab bag. life. I can only speak to how it kind of might affect me and maybe those I can imagine. But I think there's a way in which we think about ethics as people think like, how much good can I do in the world, right? Like, what good can I do in the world? This is like this fundamental orientation. And I don't know if you'll agree, but I think Jains start from a completely different perspective. They say, how much harm can I do? Like, not intentionally do I want to do harm, but like, how much harm should I be mindful of in my day-to-dayness? So, when I teach introduction to Jainism, sometimes I tell the students, like, open up your door, go outside, and just imagine, like, as the Jains do, that pretty much there are sentient beings everywhere in your vision right now, some that you cannot even see, plants, animals, humans, microscopic organisms even. And regardless of how much you buy into that based on your own kind of perspective or belief in science or Western philosophy, just understand that this is in the forefront of the Jain consciousness, is a compassion and empathy towards the suffering of others, right? We often repeat, Mahavira's realization in Atharanga Sutra and elsewhere, where Mahavira with eyes open looks around and sees how all beings are in pain, do not want pain, do not want to be destroyed. They long for life. And we could imagine they long for joy and friendship or positive experiences, right? And this is just a way in which we start to get out of the mold that animals and plants are use things for us, or that if we care about them, it's kind of like supererogatory, right? We're going above and beyond, as opposed to kind of basic empathy and duty we have to them because they, like us, do not want to feel certain things and would like to feel other things. And once we start there, I think it really does it's hard, right? Because we become cognizant of how much harm we perpetrate in the world. But also there's a sense of kinship, shared vulnerability, right? Shared duties to be kind and care for one another. And I think the Jains start this way. And yes, historically in India, kind of nonviolence and compassion, which I think are really hard to separate from one another. I don't know how you get to nonviolence without the first moment of empathy, the feeling, the recognition that the suffering of others matters. And I think we can start from that point. And in what I was saying in India, that's translated into some of our basic behaviors, such as diet. And I think the Jains realized right away that like whatever your dietary preference is, out of context, it cannot outweigh the suffering that you're imposing on certain beings to kind of satisfy it, unless it is absolutely necessary, kind of really absolutely necessary. And I think in a society now that we've realized that mass consumerism, I know you and I are on board with how much like we should be talking about degrowth and minimalism and or at least minimization, right? Jain aparigraha, how do we practice more non-accumulation, non-hoarding? Because in the West, I think we've realized that it is not making anyone happier. And so I think the Jains, I'm not saying they have an answer to how to become happy, but at least I think they provide an answer for how we can exist in the world and maybe deal with our own situation, but not kind of misguidedly inflict massive suffering on others in this futile quest to become happy through accumulation and desire satisfaction. And I wish I could say like, this is my own personal, Jonathan, you're talking from some kind of soapbox, but I think it's become common knowledge that like we view our consumer products as distractions and people will usually never insist that they have like fulfilled their ultimate happiness by getting a new espresso maker. I don't think that's a common idea. So I think the Jains can really help us to locate how much harm we can do and how can we practice that empathy in our daily lives and start to make those changes.
Yeah, that's really great. That's a good commentary. And I think that's a good answer to the question. What I particularly honed in there is what you said about the Jains as having a particular starting point, a certain axiom around which all of the worldview orients as being empathy. And it made me sort of reflect. And I think, the West is such a diverse and maybe even problematic category, but as a sort of a scholar in history of ideas, I tend to think of like, what are maybe some of the starting points of the modern West? I think of like Francis Bacon, knowledge is power, as sort of a realization to allow humans to exert greater control over the environment as being a possible starting point. The sort of epistemological vacuum of the European Enlightenment that creates a value neutrality that then assumes that reality has no value, a valueless reality starting point. There's a lot of different places that we might sort of propose various different loci of orientation of Western paradigms. And, maybe they're different across time, et cetera. But there's not very many places where I can think that like actually compassion, I think of like, maybe Jesus in the Gospels, is asked, what's the great commandment? Love the Lord thy God and love thy neighbor as thyself. It seems like Jesus is trying to point to that sort of similar axiom of empathy. But then, of course, that has been so lost with the history of the West. So I think that that's a really, really interesting point there, that the Jains seem to have managed to maintain that moral compass as a centrality of empathy is being the starting point from which all other thoughts and actions and cultures develop and literatures. And I think that is a good answer to the question of what the Jains might offer us in the West.
I'd like to add to that also like it's not a confusion. I mean, we can have a long conversation about kind of like the concept of love, and I'm not trying ever to depreciate like care ethics and the notion of affect with respect to ethics, but because we come from those in animal movement, vegan movement, this idea that people who care about animals are animal lovers. So not only does it play off this idea that's actually a kind of feminization. So I think there's a sexism at work that like you're overly in your feels, you're overly compassionate, you love animals. I'm not an animal lover, so I can do terrible things to them. So the idea is that we would never use that discourse for humans. We would never say that a human group is worth basic rights because we love them. Imagine if it said like, yes, like I love all these people that live in that country. That's why we need to do something to help them, right? Now, granted, if we want to take some notion of love, meaning compassion, right, meaning empathy, then we can go there. But the way in which animal lover is used is kind of like a backhanded slap to animal people, because it's basically saying that you're like overly sentimental. You're giving them more than they actually are due. The Jains are not saying that. The Jains are not saying that we don't harm animals because we love them. It's because they, like us, are vulnerable and are deserving of our empathy and compassion and consideration. And you're right, kind of to get what you're alluding to, because now you're talking about other religious traditions. I mean, this is fundamentally different than, say, the starting point in Abrahamic traditions, and even in, I would say, kind of pre-Hindu, late Vedic traditions that do not have this as a starting point. And so, yeah, that's another topic if we really want to talk, because I think some people probably wonder, like, what does religion have to do with any of this? Or why are we talking about religion? We can talk about that as well. But I think it's like when people say you can't escape race and you can't escape colonialism, like you can't escape religion. You can't find a plausible way out of it.
Yeah, that's an important point, the centrality of religion. I really like what you said about, and if I were to paraphrase, I would say it's more of an anthropocentric definition of love. If those animals are important because I love them. It's still putting the locus of value within the human. It's still very anthropocentric. And then that made me think a little bit more of how often we view love as a consumerist, sort of like what this person can do for me, therefore I love them. And really putting that sort of self-centered nature and then defining love in that way. I think that's a really interesting point that you make there. And it seems somewhat related to consumerism, where everybody is, or everything is viewed in like what it can do for me, or anthropocentrism might be another starting point of Western culture, which of course it certainly is. Yeah, it's nice. I work on my upcoming monograph that should be out this year on Bhakti ethics. Tries to define love in a way that avoids those types of pitfalls, but also is a counterpoint to emotivist ethics, which is another way of looking at sentimentalism. But that's another story. But I was wondering, do you have anything else that you want to say about religion? One of my previous superiors when I taught in a community college, Bill Zagneth Lester, we headed one of only two religious departments in community college in California. And he was a great visionary. And he used to always say, as a sort of a tagline, that there's no issue that you can't think of where religion is a central component of it. Religion is affected to, and what you just said there really sort of resonated with those words that I remember hearing Bill Zangnath Lester say so many times. I wonder if you might say something else about the importance of, not just ignoring religion. I think there's a sort of, particularly the sort of Marxist left, and I mean not necessarily Marxist per se, but just the Marxist influence on the left to see religion as the opiate of the masses. And if we're going to affect religious change, we need to get rid of religion. And I think that tends to be kind of almost a default setting with a lot of sort of left-leaning activists of many different stripes. So this seems to be almost sort of flying in the face of maybe what might be the common knowledge of Marxist opiate of the masses view of religion. This seems to be more like actually religion is important to engage in if we're going to create positive and progressive social change. Do you have any more to say about what role you see just religion in general in terms of not just social change, but maybe even veganism and vegan studies?
So when I teach about religion, religious studies, I mean, anyone who's gone to graduate or undergraduate studying religious studies says we could debate all day about what religion means, religious means, religions means. In a space between what I actually do philosophically and practically, I teach religion through those three B's: belief, behavior, and belonging. This is how I define like kind of religion. Like there needs to be beliefs, behaviors that in many ways are related to those beliefs, and a community. Like you can't be a religion of one. it doesn't satisfy. And if you push me a little bit, because we could say lots of things. Sports fans could fall into that, or political parties could fall into that. Marxists could fall into that. I would say that the belief, and I know you have a lot of thoughts on this as well, but maybe we could not kind of go too far off, is that the belief has to be something that cannot be empirically proven. It's kind of pointing to the existence of some alternate realm, or maybe even like certain beings or modes of existence that escape our kind of mundane existence. If you push me on that, I wouldn't be able to like pin down the answer, but for lack of a better term, something supernatural is part of that belief structure. Now, what's interesting is that people who don't like religion and kind of toe the spiritual but not religious kind of pathway, it's interesting. They think that they're getting rid of like the problematic part of religion by like the behaviors and the community, which is true, right? Religion has done religious communities, and certain behaviors have been terrible for millennia, some of them, but they often still ascribe to the beliefs, right? This kind of belief in some kind of cosmic force or nature and so on. So they're still kind of trafficking in the same ideas and the same language. I mean, I think Ken Wilber once said something like, people think they're transforming, but they end up translating. Like they just trade their vernacular. They were Christians and now they're Buddhists, but they pretty much are just moving horizontally with a different language now, unless they get involved in the real practice of transformation from within that tradition, right? Not just kind of cherry picking so it aligns with their sensibilities. So anyway, I say that all to say that when I talk about religion, is that a lot of people, even if they've eschewed their behaviors, going to church or their religious community, the kind of like the Jewish synagogue group or whatever else, they toe a lot of the same religious ideas. And so when we think about, still looking towards Genesis, right? Looking towards Genesis, and animals are created for Adam or created for man. Man names the animals. So there's a way in which man is actually this kind of like dominating force, and also names the animals, categorizes them, tells them what their use value is. I mean, this isn't like a very generous reading I'm giving, but it's a pretty common reading. But it's not just in that context. If we pivot to, say, the Vedic text, you look at the Purusha Sukta in Rig Veda 1090, which is kind of like our correlate to Genesis in an Indic context. And there's this idea that at the very moment of creation, village animals emerged. This notion of like village animals emerged. Why is that important? Is because it's making a claim that at the very moment of creation, domestication already exists. the domination of animals by humans, it's as if animals come out of, I always say, like, come out of the box on the farm. Like they've already existed on the farm. It ontologizes the farm. It ontologizes kind of exertions of power. And why am I saying that is because when people talk about animals, it's almost impossible for us to shake the idea that either they are not here for us at the very worst, or at the very best, they might not be here for us, but there's certainly not a problem with us turning them into for-use beings. And at our most generous, when we relate to animals like pets, companion animals, yes, we treat them with love and care in certain ways, but it's hard to evade the kind of biological engineering that has gone into them, the commodification of them, the kind of manicure, the cosmeticization. Like, what kind of dog do you have? Oh, it's a mix between these three dogs. Like I've designed my dog. And insofar as we treat them with any care as well, it's acted like they're part of the family, or we're going above and beyond. And anyway, I'm kind of putting a lot of things together in a jumble here, but the idea is that religion has so much dictated how we think about ourselves and animals. And I don't think we can get out of that thinking until we engage with the religious legacies that brought us here. Whether or not we then kind of reinvigorate our own religious background or convert or do something else, that's a different question. But in my opinion, it's impossible to deny how much religion has shaped the way we think about animals. I mean, we could go on and on. We could talk about kind of the myth of the cow, the holy cow, and the mother cow in India and outside also is informed by religious thinking. So I don't know how we escape that issue.
Yeah, that's wow, so much there. We could have a whole podcast episode on that. If religion is part of the problem, religion must be part of the solution. And alienating religious people and just trying to dispose of them and envision a world without them is hardly going to be the democratic approach to social change that one might hope for. I also might mention that I've got a background in constructive theology, and I did a lot of eco-theology in my PhD dissertation, and my upcoming book is on that as well. And I've been very impressed at, the Christian eco-theology. I mean, eco-theology is a field that was created almost entirely by Christians because they saw the problematic natures, the book of Genesis and things like that, the dominion paradigm and that sort of thing. And they try to reframe those in such a way that are affirming of the value of the environment, natural world, and animals. And so constructive theologians are really working hard to sort of see religion transformed into a more compassionate paradigm. And I've written and published works on eco-theology as a methodology. This is one paper that I've written. And
I'd like to add, though, not to mention that proponents of critiques of kind of wholesale religion traffic in a very archaic notion of religion as static and not dynamic and not transformative. And this only reifies the notion of, say, indigenous cultures as also kind of locked in time that don't change. And then at the same time, you're not listening to, say, voices within these traditions, indigenous voices, or people within religious communities saying, like, no, actually, like, we're actually dynamic. We actually have agency. We actually think about where we come from. And just to give an example, right, there's a lot of figures in kind of indigenous veganisms, like Margaret Robinson comes to mind right now, but who say, like, no, we're not promoting veganism in our communities based on importing kind of a Western viewpoint or worldview. We're not actually saying that that's our worldview. What we are is we're engaging with our own stories and our own histories and saying that given the contemporary period, actually our own worldviews and beliefs point us in a new direction. And we have a responsibility to our own traditions to modify. I mean, it's actually, we're not departing from tradition. We're kind of, like you say, constructively changing, but adhering to it. And so when, Chris Miller and I wrote a bit on Jain veganism, the critique that it's actually some kind of deviation from Jainism because it's a depart from earlier practices traffics in this completely obsolete notion of religion that practices don't change. If anything, Jains are trying to live their values and now see like, wow, we can live our values even better. Or the terrain has changed in such a way that we have to modify our practices. So like one great example, and I just have to say it because I think it's such a wonderful line, is that like a lot of traditions, when you study histories of sacrifice and food prescriptions, they talk about how killing animals is necessary. And in many ways, animals in indigenous traditions and other traditions almost are claimed to consent to their own slaughter and their own being consumed because it's necessary. The question is, what happens when it's not necessary anymore, right? If the thinking was predicated on this kind of contract based in necessity, you think, well, if those conditions don't apply, then maybe the conclusions change. And Matthew Scully, this is what I was trying to say. Matthew Scully, in his book Dominion, I believe, says something like, when a necessary evil is no longer necessary, it's just evil. And so that's the idea. When the conditions change, religions change. They're dynamic. And so the kind of religion deserves to be critiqued, but this kind of wholesale critique as if it's completely dogmatic and unflinching is inaccurate. And like you said, you work in a field that is pretty much focused on the constructive processes of religion.
That was brilliant, Jonathan. Thank you so much. And you've really kind of come full circle with this idea of vegan studies being flexible to local ideas. I really liked how you underscored that. And again, I could ask you 100 more questions just based on what you just said. I recently wrote a piece on spiritual bypassing and do-it-yourself slaughter, that was published in Hope Bohanec's Humane Hoax Anthology as the chapter. And it dealt with a lot of that, myth of consent and these animals being, willingly and only having one bad day and all of that. It seems the spiritualizing of the language of slaughter, which is so distasteful, definitely was something I was very concerned with there. And I still see as part of the sort of like urban homesteading and foodie sort of movement is very much part of that. Okay, so
I'm going to interrupt one last time. Just one last time is like, also do it is that like how much of that falls into this fall narrative. I mean, how religious is our thinking about the notion that we've like lost our ways? Things were perfect once, and we've kind of like lost our way, and we have to return to some Eden, right? That's our problem. I mean, just that idea itself, and in the Indic context, it's true. We have some kind of semblance of that. But my point is that how religiously inflected our notions are, because you talk to a historian, you talk about the good old days, and they'll say there were no good old days. There was no time when things were great, and now we're somehow terrible. So it's like exactly with regenerative agriculture, homesteading, and going back to old ways. It's so religious, shot through with religious thought, and it just made me think of it once more.
Yeah, wonderful commentary. Okay, we're running to the end of our time here, but I think despair is sort of the enemy of social change, and it's really hard to do the kind of work that you do without being immersed in despair. But I think that with despair socially, it creates fatalism. People feel helpless, and then it becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy where if people feel like they can't do anything, then they don't do anything, and then the change that's needed never happens. So this is why I married a woman named Hope, but this is why I think hope is so essential to social change. So is a little final question that I borrowed from my wife's podcast. What gives you hope in seeing positive change with the animals?
Yeah, so there's an obvious answer. I mean, there's just the way that, I grew up. I didn't meet a vegetarian until my junior year of college. I did not know what the term vegan meant. I don't know. I never heard it until years later. So we're obviously in a different time in which, yes, we can see the ubiquity of the language, of the products, of the quote unquote lifestyle or disposition. So we see that happening. We see more animal rights advocates and activists than ever. We see it happening transnationally. That's the great side. I think we're seeing more people speak up for animals and it being accepted. it's hard, right? It's coming at the same time where there's more animals being exploited than ever before. And the ways in which we exploit animals is worse, arguably, than ever before. So I think, we do the work regardless. That's kind of what gives me hope. And it seems that people are still unbelievably transformed by changing the way they relate to other animals and other humans and can think in these networks of intersectional networks at a loss for a better term. But also, like, just not to let animals get lost in this is that, animals are not some kind of faceless, anonymous mass. Like, go to a sanctuary, experience it. Like, these are individuals, right? Individuals who have preferences, likes, dislikes, their own family, their friends, even people they don't like, right? You go to a sanctuary, you find animals don't like other animals. And I say all that as what gives me hope is that if you can start changing your diet to reduce how many of these individuals are killed and eventually be on a path towards kind of this vegan horizon point, or if you can rescue animals, like, it means the world to them. That's what's different. If someone says, why should I rescue a chicken when 300 chickens are killed every second in the United States? Why would I do that? What's one compared to 300 every second? But for that one chicken, it means everything. And that's more than doing nothing. So you can keep that in mind of how much you can do for individuals, while at the same time realizing that, yes, there's kind of endless work to be done. But seeing people like yourself and your wife and others kind of stay involved, stay active, take care of themselves, take care of those around them as they do it, that gives me hope for the future.
And I will reciprocate. Seeing academics like you gives me incredible hope for the future. This was unthinkable 30 years ago when I first went vegan. And thank you for your work. It's really inspiring, and the importance of it could not be overstated. I really appreciated our enlivening and enlightening conversation that we've had today. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in to our Engaged Jain Studies podcast held through Arihanta Institute. And thank you for listening. And I hope you enjoyed and benefited from today's discussion as much as I personally did. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute, an IRC 501c3 nonprofit California corporation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or better yet, tell a friend and share it with a colleague. At Arihanta Institute, we bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary living through accessible, self-paced online courses, free events, and a first-of-its-kind Master of Arts program in Engaged Jain Studies. Visit arihantainstitute.org to learn how our curriculum spanning Jain philosophy, social justice, veganism, environmental studies, and more can enrich your understanding of timeless principles in today's context. Jai Jinendra.